All right, Krystal, what's on your radar?
Well, we are getting to the end of the year here, and so Sagar and I actually wanted to do something a little bit different for our radars both today and tomorrow, a sort of year in review. Today we're going to look at the greatest fails of 2020. It was actually pretty difficult to narrow down the list, and obviously, the worst thing about 2020 has been the pandemic, the 300,000 people dead, so we'll sort of have that overlaying as the obvious context of 2020. But the first thing that, to me, came to mind, and I'm going in sort of chronological order here, as the greatest fail of 2020 is if you circle back to the Democratic primary, and you had the situation where Bernie wins the popular vote in Iowa, he wins New Hampshire, he racks up this massive victory in Nevada, goes into South Carolina, loses as expected to Joe Biden, never expected to win in that state, but still in good position to win. And then what happens? Obama starts making phone calls. Pete drops out. Amy drops out. Elizabeth Warren just stays in the race, but doesn't endorse anyone. And ultimately, all of the dominoes fall and make it so that Joe Biden just rolls to victory. Now, it's easy in retrospect to see, that, that this was obviously going to happen, or that, Joe was always the favorite, being the former vice president, and that, of course, he was going to ultimately win. But it's easy to forget how close Bernie came. If Pete had stayed in the race, if Warren had gotten out of the race, if Klobuchar had stayed in the race, if those things had all stayed in place and the field remained divided, Bernie would have become the nominee. And then you'd be in a very different situation in terms of what would be on the table and what would be possible for this next administration as we're facing some of the greatest challenges that we've ever faced in this nation's history. So even though it ended up not being that close in the end, going back to that moment when Obama intervenes and gets Pete to put his ego aside and drop out of the race and everybody else and to endorse and coalesce around Joe Biden, that, to me, was one of the greatest fails of 2020 and one of the greatest missed opportunities. The second one is kind of obvious. Look, coronavirus was always going to be terrible. But if you look around the world, there are obviously many, many countries that handled this way better than we did. I mean, we have had one of the worst responses in the entire world. Now we've had more than 300,000 people die. Yesterday, we set a new record for the number of deaths in this country. So what I think of here is obviously the Trump response, but very specifically the way that he knew better. He knew how deadly this was from the beginning, because it had always been kind of a question with him, does he actually know and he's just lying, or is he so willing to believe whatever he wants to and taking in these insane news sources that he actually has deluded himself into thinking that this is no big deal? When we got the Bob Woodward book, and more importantly, the audio associated with that book, we found out that Trump knew exactly how deadly this was, and he intentionally downplayed it and had a completely embarrassingly lackluster response. Let's take a listen to that.
It goes through air, Bob. That's always tougher than the touch. The touch, you don't have to touch things, right? But the air, you just breathe the air, and that's how it's passed. And so that's a very tricky one. That's a very delicate one. It's also more deadly than your strenuous flus. This is deadly stuff.
More deadly than even your most strenuous flus. That was back in February, early February, when he was saying that. Privately, even as publicly, he's saying it's just like the flu. The post office actually had a plan in place to mail every American a mask to take this thing seriously from the jump. And they killed that plan. They constantly just wanted to reopen, didn't want to lock down, didn't want to do what was necessary in order to make sure that we could get this thing under control and get back to normal life. And that is perhaps the greatest fail of 2020. Related to that was not only did we fail on the pandemic, dealing with the illness itself, but the failure in Congress to pass meaningful stimulus that would get Americans through the inevitable economic depression that accompanied this pandemic. And I really go back to the very first major stimulus bill that was passed here, the CARES Act, which passed through the Senate with unanimous support. Every single member of the Senate backed this thing. And look, the time, those initial pieces, the unemployment plus up, the direct stimulus payments, those were great. And they actually caused poverty to decline at the time. But meanwhile, business got everything they wanted. You'll recall the stock market was crashing at the time. That's why there was any impetus to get anything done. Business got trillions of dollars shot at them. Federal Reserve, they did everything they could to essentially socialize the stock market and corporate returns. Meanwhile, Americans were left with short-term help, and when it expired, that's been it. That's all that we've gotten. So the fact that unlike every other developed country, we didn't have a plan in place to automatically backstop people's payrolls, to have automatic direct stimulus checks until we got through this, that has been one of the greatest economic failures in history, but certainly in the year 2020. And Sagar, I keep thinking, as we go through the stimulus debate and all of that, I keep thinking back to that original piece of legislation. And we knew at the time that the minute you give the corporations everything they want,
in perpetuity, and recurring.
Exactly. All the leverage is gone.
Right.
And meanwhile, you leave people to fight for scraps. And that has been the underlying dynamic that has screwed up the stimulus for this entire period.
No, it has. And the stimulus part is so terrible. And you can go, and the systemic failure of it is actually, I've almost found it difficult, I think we both have, to communicate it to people because it's easier when it's just Mitch. It's easier when it's just Trump. And it's easier when it's Pelosi. But it's all three. And it's Steve Mnuchin. And it's every Fortune 500 CEO. And it's 98 U.S. senators. And it's the majority of the House caucus of both Republicans and Democrats. There are like a handful, like we could count on two hands of the number of people who were good actors in this entire system. So how do you explain such a total failure of government? It's basically like the financial crisis in almost every way, where the conventional wisdom was wrong, where the bailout bails out the wrong people, where the bill is structured in such a way that the people who really need the help don't get it, where their needs are allowed to peter out until the very end. And now we're sitting here today, and we might get us another $600, $700 stimulus check. And again, it was a titanic victory just to get it.
Right.
But what does that tell you about the system when every other developed country in the world was like, oh yeah, recurring revenue, a recurring check like $2,000 a month, or half your payroll, or whatever. You're not going to go hungry. You're all good. Their economies and their societies are far more robust than what we have here. And I'm going to be talking about this in mine, but I'll mention it here, which is that by polarizing this among political lines and making it like a culture war fight, it was dead. From pretty much the day those lockdown protests started, it was over. And I think that was one of those moments where we're going to look back and just be like, what the hell have we done? In terms of how we did this. And we just created probably a decade or more of suffering for no reason.
Cascading elite failures in the pandemic response, and Trump was not alone. We covered Cuomo and many other problems here. The public health officials, the idea at the beginning that masks, masks don't actually work. Don't get masks, and then comes out that actually they knew all along that masks work. They just didn't want to buy up the supply and keep them from frontline healthcare workers. Understandable goal, but you can't lie to people, right? That's part of how we ended up in such a terrible place to start with. But cascading elite failures in terms of dealing with the disease, cascading elite failures in terms of dealing with the economic response. And then you also have this elite collusion to keep the one person who might be well positioned to actually, reinvent the economy and provide people with what they need in order to ameliorate the insane inequality that we're going to have going forward. Elite collusion to destroy that person. Yeah. That's the story of this year.
No, it is. And, the only reason I'm in politics is really because of the war in Iraq. And, you see when you're a kid and you're like, this is wrong. And when you really study it, it's the same thing. You're like, well, it was President Bush, but it was the intel community. And then it was the people who worked for Bush. But then it was people like Biden. And then it was people like Hillary. It was people like John Kerry, many others who beat the war drum for his side in Congress. And then it was the collusion of everybody else for 2 straight years to be like, it's not so bad over there. And very small dissident voices out there were like, hey, this is a nightmare that's going on. Our troops are getting killed. And you can see that information was suppressed for years.
No, those were the people, the ones who lost their jobs were the ones who were correct, who were morally righteous. Those were the ones who were punished.
And then the same same thing happens in the financial crisis, and then the same thing happens with Libya, and then now the same thing happens here. And this is going to be just as big of a scarring event as Iraq and the financial crisis. Everybody thinks you can just move on from these things.
Yeah.
A couple years later, it's all good. But it just cannot be that way. And the correction will come at some point. I don't know when, where, etc., how, especially with all of the current systems that we have in place. But we will never forget what has been done to us here. And it will live on, I think, in all of our political DNA, probably until the end of our lives. It's just like the Great Depression for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely right. We'll be living with the consequences of the failures, not just the things that happened that were inevitable, but the specific elite failures and elite conspiracies of 2020 are going to be with us for decades. All right, Sagar, looking forward to yours. That's next.